Welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. This episode of Lateral Think is sponsored by Melbourne Athletic Development. We do this podcast to have interesting conversations with interesting people. We want to get better results because we want to improve the outcomes that we get with the clients that we work with. If you have questions or need help with your performance or injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. Today we're very lucky to have with us Mark Stewart. Mark wears many hats, one of which is an elite level pole vault coach. He's also a university lecturer. I don't know what your exact title is, Mark. You can probably elucidate that one for us. But has been able to combine a lot of that into both coach education and the development of the sport overall for a really long period of time. So we're really lucky to have him join us today. Mark, do you want to give our listeners a little bit of a background on who you are and what you do?
Okay, so yes, I was a university academic for almost 30 years and in economics and finance, but my research area was sports economics in the last probably decade or so. I've always coached athletics and I'm a pole vault coach, and I've coached quite a lot of athletes to international level. And I've also worked on and off with Athletics Australia. At the end, with the pandemic, I ended up leaving RMIT, where I used to work as a university lecturer, and then I've got a job now with Athletics Australia. So I work, and my title is High Performance Coach Development Coordinator, and so that is about helping our coaches to get more elite results. So that's what I'm doing now.
How are you finding that?
It's challenging. It's good.
Why? Why is it challenging?
It's challenging because track and field is like 20 different sports in one. And
it is an interesting concept, that, because I don't think a lot of people always recognise it. I think that they sort of see, well, it's just running or jumping or throwing, and it's one continuous kind of event, but it's really not, is it?
No, it's as I said, it's many different people, different aspects, different personalities across the event groups, and all of those sorts of things, and that makes it difficult. But it's also, I mean, to me, it's a great job from my point of view. I've been given a position where I'm trying to help coaches, and I'm passionate about coaching and coaches and getting results in athletics. And so, you know, I'm privileged really to work in this area.
There's a couple of aspects that I wanted to talk to you about today that I think are interesting. Like, one is obviously you come from lecturing at university, so teaching in a tertiary setting. Mm-hmm. First, I think the question is, like, how does that differ to teaching people who come from more of a coaching background? Because some of them, and I guess a lot of them are probably well educated, but some of them are not. How do you see the difference playing out with the way you actually have to construct sort of education streams?
Well, you're right. See, some people won't respond well to, you know, sorts of things that you do in a university setting, you know, statistics and all this sort of stuff, that sort of thing. So you've got to be careful with that sort of thing. But then I would, rather than say to people, this is what you should do, what I usually have done with any sort of coach education is say, this is what I do, this is why I do it, and explain the process. Then they can take and leave it if they want to be involved in it. How do
you think that plays out, though? Because there's obviously going to be people who don't engage with that. If you give it to them to do nothing, they'll do nothing.
Well, that does happen, yes. And if that's the case, you can't really do much about it. One of the things about track and field, and like I work for Athletics Australia. Athletics Australia is highly dependent on getting results at the elite level. They're funded by the Australian Sports Commission to get results at elite level. But the people who are getting them results are largely just, I could call them hobby coaches. They're not really hobby coaches, because people like John...
They're personal coaches.
They're personal coaches. They're people who are doing it. They're not being paid. Very few of them are being paid within the system. And so you don't have much control over someone if they don't want to, if they're not being...
I was going to actually ask, do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing?
I think, well, it means it's harder to get good results.
You think so?
I think so.
The thing I think of straight away is if you have all these individuals that are independent of an organisation, there's a potential for them to have much more autonomous thinking, and that with that comes creativity and the opportunity to create new ideas or different perspectives.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a good point. In fact, I do certainly go along with that. No, but it's in terms of controlling and getting people to, like if you're in a professional football team or something and all the people are paid, you say you do this, and if you don't do it, then obviously they don't know how to keep working. Whereas in athletics, it's much more atomistic, I suppose. Like people doing this, doing that, all over the place. And in fact, it relates a bit to what, like another aspect of my life, because I taught and studied economics. Now, economics people, most of the economists have sort of want the market to solve things.
You don't trust economists, do you?
Yeah.
We should actually ask you about this.
Well, I have to say, there's a few questions that come to my mind just because of my interest of economics in the financial world and about what a lot of investors in the industry say about economists. Because,
well, they say there's all different opinions and all that stuff. So yeah, people like to put the boots in, all that sort of thing. But if you could just bear with me for a second, one of the things, like free market economists usually say the government should set up the infrastructure, they should, and then get out of the way, let things, and people, and the market will solve problems and all that sort of stuff. There's certain things you need the government for and you can't get away with it. And in fact, in track and field, I think to some extent that is the case as well. Like the national body, Athletics Australia, who I work for, starts getting involved telling people to do this and this and this and this.
Doesn't work, no. Well, I think that's, I don't want this to turn into a political discussion because it can easily descend into that. But I think it's one of the cool things about the economic sphere, and particularly economic systems, fall into the category of being sort of complex dynamic systems. And they do have the ability to self-organise. And that's why it's interesting, because they can create solutions that weren't potentially even obvious on the surface.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happens in track and field. But I think the key point that you brought forward is that at a governmental level, and for us, say at the NSO level, you need certain structures.
Yep.
And the main reason for that is for people who don't understand, with complex adaptive systems, essentially parts of the system die off in order for the stronger parts to survive, and they get amplified because the weaker ones it's like survival of the fittest.
Darwinian.
The issue that you have with that is if we allow that to happen economically, there would be a lot of people that have to blow up in order for there to be success. And then it becomes a bit of a monopoly system like what we've seen with the tech companies, right?
Yeah.
And that's why governments have to step in and stop certain things and tax people properly and all that kind of stuff. And you can correct me because I'm kind of...
No, you're doing... That's reasonably accurate. It's a good economy, yeah.
I
could add a few more, but...
Yeah, and I'm sure it's much more in-depth than what I'm saying. But the issue that we have, I guess, with some of the stuff with our sport is I don't know that actually Athletics Australia has identified those really basic cornerstones that they need to put in place in order to allow that free market system or that sort of complex system to create solutions. And I'll give a really basic example. The most basic example, and I know that when we spoke to Avish, he brought this up, the performance scientist from the BIS. The most basic thing that a decent coach needs is access to a training facility consistently. And one of the big things that Athletics Australia is not interested in getting involved in pretty much is that. And I find that really interesting, right? Because to me, that's the baseline. If you've got good coaches or you think that you've got good coaches, give them somewhere to actually do their job.
Yeah, I can tell you why they don't, because it's not within their remit. They don't have the ability to do anything about that. It's the local city councils and all that sort of stuff.
Well, they could.
Well, it's a fairly limited budget in Athletics Australia.
No, I understand, but what I'm saying is they could. For instance, in some states it's better than what it is here, but I know that in every state, most of the coaches, one of the first things that always comes up and always gets brought up is access to training facilities consistently, particularly the state training facility. Ours is a disaster. Yeah.
We were at a local club, so... Yeah.
No, I'm not saying... I'm saying Lakeside Stadium,
Lakeside.
for instance.
Yeah.
Obviously, I sound like I'm complaining, which I kind of am, but...
I was just saying, it sounds like it. Anyway, keep going.
I think the thing that's interesting for you is, in a similar manner, what are the key sort of central points for you that you think are important for that development of a coach? That if you've given them this sort of free market system to kind of develop, what are the things you think that you do need to give them? And for that reason, what have you guys done?
All right. So relating back to what it was, the coach is like an entrepreneur to me, like in a business success. The coach is every day, they're in there, this works, that doesn't work, I won't do this because it's not working, now I'll try this, and that works, I'll push it this way. And that's what a business person does. So what is the government's role in the market economy? It's to provide infrastructure and things like this and correct for market failures and bits and pieces. Track and field, to me, the major job of the national body is to provide the things that has to be provided, which actually is competitions, national teams, and then some incentives, and then the coaches should be left alone to do that sort of thing. Now, in terms of education, yes, we have, and they need to be, and the coaches need to be accredited. They need to be qualified. They need to do their own insurance, all that sort of stuff. There's working with children. There's all of this sort of thing that has to be done, and so that's the major body to me. And providing the right incentives is the key. And so providing teams that are accessible, a stepping stone of teams, underage teams, etc., etc. That's really the major thing that Athletics Australia should be doing.
I feel like they do a pretty good job of that.
Yeah.
I think that we offer opportunities for people if they're there. And there seems to be a current policy from the selection panel that they'll select everyone who qualifies at the moment, which has not always been the case.
Correct.
And we've seen that play out in other countries like New Zealand, where particular number of athletes were very pissed off about the fact that they didn't get given opportunities that they actually were entitled to, or at least had qualified for through the world body.
Yeah, I think that's the way in which World Athletics is selecting things has made it. Athletics Australia has to do that, because if you, according to World Athletics, can compete in a competition and then Athletics Australia says you can't, doesn't pick you, then you can take legal action against them and you'll probably be successful. Yeah. So that's what's happening now. That causes significant budgetary problems for Athletics Australia, because that means that they're supporting more teams, and it costs a lot of people. I mean, I've had athletes say to me, if I need support, I can make a team. Now, someone just making a team from Athletics Australia's point of view is not good.
No.
Because it costs them money. If someone's got to make a team and do well, then the Sports Commission will assess that, and they will get better funding. And that's how it's all based upon. So really, but it's tricky because, of course, you can't say picking winners is almost impossible. Yeah. Like picking,
who's going to be successful?
Who's going to be successful? Who's not? And people think they can, but they can't. I can tell you, I was national junior pole vault coach for nearly 15 years, and it was so, you think this kid and that doesn't work, this kid's going to be really good, and now they are, and all this sort of stuff.
It makes me think, like Jack and I have spoken about this before, but the idea that, particularly in, say, some sort of complex system, the ability to predict is actually quite minimal.
That's right.
Because you don't know what's happening in the interaction between a lot of those variables that, tend to have influence on the outcome, but maybe interacting in very non-linear ways.
Yeah. See, what people love to do, within sports administration, is they have a PowerPoint display, and they have a pyramid, and all of these people in it, they all get to It doesn't seem to happen like that, from my experience. You've got all this sort of mess of schools comps and club comps and all this sort of stuff, and kids emerge, but you need to have as many as possible trying to get a result, because then you've got more chance of getting a good one. And that's what we from the point of view of the national body, they need some good results, because if they don't, they'll be defunded.
Here's a question as someone with an economics background. Do you think that one of the major in my mind, so I'll be open with this, I think one of the major problems Athletics Australia has is that they rely on government funding.
100%.
As someone without the economic background, are there solutions that you can see, based on your knowledge, that they actually could explore but they haven't been able to do? Not that they haven't tried it, but they haven't been able to successfully navigate just yet. Yeah.
Well, one of the things, in terms of coach development, one of the things that we talked about some other questions. One of the things is coach development. It's very hard to do it if you're just doing it ad hoc, part-time. To me, the key is to be able to set things up so that the coaches can earn some income and do it and then do it more professionally. Now, it's very hard, but it's like what the swimming coaches do. Like, the swimming coaches have their swim schools. They get their good swimmers to teach in it and all this sort of thing, and their elite swimmers are their advertising. They're why people will come and get a kid. And that's what we need. And there are people doing this in Australia, and this is one of the things because we could say, wouldn't it be terrific if we can employ all these full-time track and field coaches? Ain't going to happen. I can tell you, there's not going to be that much money. There'll be more in the next in the lead up to the Olympics in
but
Brisbane.
But that's a transient thing.
It's transient, then it'll stop again, and they're not going to do it. So we really need more and more people being able to run some sort of coaching business where they've still got time to do elite coaching as well. And so
here's a question for you. Have you seen that play out? Because as soon as you say that, I think about the swimming clubs and the way that the swimming clubs tend to work. You can correct me if you know more, but you've got hundreds of kids learning to swim.
Yep.
They all pay their membership fees, term fee, whatever it is.
Yep.
And it means that, say, during the day or afternoons, kids are doing swimming lessons. And then generally in the mornings, the pool's being used by the elites, and that's being funded, or at least the coaching, a lot of it is being funded by those memberships and all that kind of thing. Is that sort of how it works?
Yeah, that is.
I'm sure there's other things they do.
Yeah, there's different. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that they do. And
have you ever seen that play out at an athletics club?
Not in a precise way, but it certainly plays out in an athletics club with individuals.
Yeah, but
not the club itself organising it, and
it makes me think that if Athletics Australia actually would keen on it, there actually would be potential to do something like that. One of the biggest problems they face, and this is not their doing actually, because they were obviously well for it, is the amalgamation with Little Athletics, but that obviously went sour for who knows what particular reasons. It seems a bit sad that didn't happen.
Very sad. Yeah. Oh, look, there's been moves and all these sorts of things, and there are people who do that. I mean, you probably know Aussie Aths. They've run a system like that, and Athletics Australia's been talking. They've been trying to implement it, but it's very hard to say this is the model that we're going to back. There are individuals doing it. Most clubs, the clubs are just run by
volunteers,
complete volunteers. They don't have time to do all this sort of stuff. But if certain clubs do start employing people, it's interesting. Like I'm involved with gymnastics, like we train at gymnastics. Most gymnastics clubs will have one or two people full-time or close to full-time working in running, organising, all this sort of stuff. I don't think there's any track and field club in Australia that does that, as far as I know, virtually, where they actually can pay someone a salary. I mean, we do pay people bits and pieces to do things. But
but it's not formalised in any...
No, that sort of thing. So I do think that running a coaching business is a very important thing, and we're going to do some talks about presentations and people who've done it and that sort of thing. And that's something I think would help track and field.
Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of the learning side of things, I think you and I have had these discussions because, I was fortunate enough to be part of the program that you're actually running.
Yep.
And one of the big pillars of what you're doing is a mentoring program.
Yep.
And I find it interesting because I think mentoring works, in my mind at least, mentoring works well, particularly for people who are not self-starters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it works really well in hindsight. And what I mean by that is, and I'm happy to say this, I did the program last year and I've decided not to do the program this coming year, even though I found it extremely helpful. Mm-hmm. And the reason is one of the big things that I think if you're reasonably self-aware and willing to pursue things is you ask a lot of questions of yourself and your coaching and what you're doing. However, even as a coach, having confidence in what you're doing relies on you not nitpicking every single piece of, behavioural thing that you're doing or your athletes are doing. Mm. And I actually have already noticed a number of the things that I picked up, particularly from my mentor, who I had a fantastic mentor, is helping me now, even though I'm not continuing to do that formally.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And that's what I'm saying. I feel like in hindsight, it's really useful, but while you're in it, it's maybe not as useful, which is a weird kind of place to be. I don't know what your thoughts are on something like that.
I think that's...
Do you think that's just reflective of the reality is we receive information at different points in our life, whether that's relevant to you at that point in time may not be the case?
Yeah, and also that as I said, while you're in something, it's difficult to be able to see the broader picture.
Sure.
But once you can step back and you don't have that sort of information coming in, it's easier to then use what you've learned.
Yeah. And I reckon it's hard when you're involved in that and you're coaching at the same time.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Because because the mentoring will make you question yourself.
Yep.
But when you're a coach, in front of your athletes.
You can't do that.
You can't. You've got to say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and we're going to, etc. And it's tricky, yeah. It's almost like you should go off to a retreat and do this sort of thing and then come back and...
Well, I think also too is you have a framework in your mind, and as you gather new information, the time it takes to actually build up that new bit of information into your neural network, it takes a certain context. It might take, 6 months of going for a walk every morning, and then all of a sudden it just happens, which is actually something that's very common when you see understanding like neuroscience.
With that in mind, like, how do you, Mark, sort of see the evolution of, this education for coaches? Because traditionally there has been this apprentice style, mentorship stuff, but, and again, it's probably my obstinance more than anything, I actually think that presents some problems because you should want to go and seek this stuff out yourself. Like, funnily enough, without even knowing him, I reached out to the person who ended up becoming my mentor about 4 or 5 years ago, asking questions because I respected the information that they already had.
Yeah, that's. I mean, you can say it's Tudor Bitter as your mentor.
Yeah,
we can say that.
I think I've mentioned Tudor before.
In this podcast. So yeah, and he's terrific, and he's a highly experienced coach and all that sort of thing. So you were saying if you don't, one of the things that I found when setting up this program is some of the mentee coaches, the coaches who we want to get results from, actually nominated people who even coached them previously.
Yeah, I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, well, it is to some extent. But one of the things that they would tell me is, I really always wanted to ask them questions in my coaching all the time, but felt terribly guilty by imposing on them doing it. But then if they were part of the formal program, because we pay the mentors, not a lot of money, but we pay them something. So, of course, they're
I always think that's dangerous because it's sort of like, as that saying goes, never meet your heroes. I feel like you'd end up being disappointed. I don't know. Maybe that's just my.
Well, I don't know. As I said, there's a number of them who are happy, and then to be able to spend more, without feeling guilty, continually question them. But you're right. It is better to talk to someone else as well, because obviously, if someone's coached you, you've learned a lot from them already. Yeah. I would have thought.
And you probably know a lot of their philosophies,
and you probably replicate a lot what they do as well. I do. People who coach me, that sort of thing. So yeah.
With this in mind, do you think that this process has influenced what you think is useful in, say, a tertiary setting?
At university? Yes. I mean, I think in a university it would be really good if you could do it something like what we're doing here, but it's just like universities, it's just a big business. It's like a sausage factory, like this. Seriously. It is. You got, we'd always, this is back to my job as an academic. I used to, I'm trying to run classes of hundreds of students and all this sort of stuff and teach all this sort of thing, and then we'd have all these things from the teaching and learning people, and they'd come up with all of these things, and you've got to do this and this and this. And if I wanted to do all of the touchy-feely sort of stuff that they did, I'd go crazy. I couldn't do it because, of course, I've got to deal with so many more students. And so, of course, you do have to develop a process. Now, in having individual people at universities and mentoring and all that sort of stuff, yeah, that would be great, I'm sure. But I just can't imagine, unless you're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year fees or something, like that sort of thing.
It's going that way almost.
Well, it is going that way. But yeah, universities, they're international students, money, et cetera, that's what it's all about. So... Anyway.
So what's fundamentally different from your perspective, being an academic, working in that industry, and teaching, versus being a coach, where obviously a big part of what you do with your athletes is also teaching and education? How does that differ?
How does it differ? Well, it's quite a different process in terms of sport, although dealing with young people is pretty similar, like that sort of thing. In university, one of the big things with university, actually, even though you were expected to teach and teach well, the big way in which you were assessed was on your research. That was the key. And so, whereas I suppose as a coach, you're assessed on your results of your athletes. So they're sort of different things. So, yeah.
I bring this up all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that people who are in competitive pursuits are lucky because they get put in a position where they have to get results. And I actually think that that's really important. And the reason that I think it's important is it teaches you very quickly to get rid of superfluous crap. And there's too many people who think that certain things are, say, KPIs, but they're actually not, because they're not driving the needle on the end result. And I think it's one of the criticisms that Jack and I consistently have around, say, physical therapy research is they do research on things that it doesn't probably transfer if you're actually in a clinical setting, but they got a result in their research, and then they could therefore publish their paper.
And it's about the number of publications. So it's not always about the impact factor of the research you produce, but just the sheer quantity. But there's another question I was going to ask to follow up. When you think about, again, being in two very different environments, do you wish coaching was more like, do you wish some of the athletes you work with approached their performance and development like they're at university, or vice versa? Do you wish at university?
I think good athletes and good students have some significant similarity in that training is like studying. You consistently study every day and work towards a goal. You train consistently and work towards a goal. It's the people who can't do that, either as athletes or as students, who don't succeed, mostly, unless they're massively talented or in athletes or hugely smart, innately something. But that's the thing. And there are people like that who don't have to work so hard to get good results in most things. But it's very, very similar in terms of just working towards a particular, like anything in life, you've got to work. So one of the things, I'm just going to take up one thing, you're talking about publications and all that sort of stuff. See, that's one of the things that happened in universities. When I first worked at universities, there was hardly any universities. There was Monash and Melbourne Uni and Lateral and all the other things weren't universities in the sense that they weren't not expected to produce knowledge. The difference between a school and a university, a school just purveys knowledge, teaches, a university creates knowledge and then delivers it. All of a sudden, when in the early 90s, we used to call the Dawkins reforms, when they converted all of these colleges of advanced education into universities, all of a sudden there were all these people who were really not academics, but they were tertiary teachers of some description. Then, all of a sudden, they were expected to be university academics and researchers and all that sort of thing. So many of them that was the end of them. But then they got more and more in. Now what you've got this huge amount of pressure to produce research outcomes, and it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it gets published in a referee journal, then you're ticking the box. And so whether it's relevant to which is what you guys are doing, or anything else, and I was certainly part of it, like I had to publish, otherwise I was going to get shot, eventually I did lose my job, but like that's the sort of thing. So whether it's relevant or not to what's going on in an applicable, practical sense is not necessarily the case.
Do you read a lot of research yourself these days, particularly related to coaching?
I do a bit, yes. The woman I work with, Di Huxley, she did her PhD in coaching, which is not what I did, but so she's quite on top of that. So there's certainly coaching journals. I've written a few papers that were published. I had one paper two papers in academic coaching journal. So I do.
Do you use any particular process for when you read research and gather new information, and how you transfer that into what you do as a coach?
To some extent, one of the things that you actually find you can do, because given I was an academic, is if you're trying to do something, then you find some research, and then you go through Google Scholar, and then you cite the right references, and then everyone at Athletics Australia, they're really smart. We should listen to them, but that's because we know the system. So look, you're trying to see for practical applications. You're trying to see if the paper was done well, because you can write. I can assess. I did a lot of refereed a lot of papers. I assessed PhD students, all that sort of stuff. And if it's good research, whereas so usually from my point of view, I'm looking for quantitative stuff. Like because that was my background, something that's measurable in some way, rather than just you reckon or all this. When you have all these things where it's just qualitative, interviews with people and focus groups on this and that. And it is, because of course that can be dominated by particular opinions, all that sort of stuff, and biases, but I'm always looking for numbers. And that's why I coach as well. I'm always keeping stats and all that sort of thing and trying to look at results. So that's probably where, in terms of, I hope that's answering what you said.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because I've also work at Lateral Uni teaching in the physio department. Yep. And it's something that I'm always constantly observing and thinking and criticising about, of how we actually get that transfer of knowledge from at an academic level into real world application. Because sometimes I see within our profession there's too much of a almost direct inference of thinking, well, this is what we found, therefore this is what we need to do in the real world.
Yeah.
And I think that's problematic. I think the issue that you have with a lot of academics is they know their research, they may or may not work clinically, that's the other issue too.
Yeah, yeah.
And then they also may not know how their research fits into the bigger puzzle, so to speak. And so I'm interested for someone like you, obviously being from that perspective of being an academic, understanding what is involved in the research process and understanding how to be critical of it, but then also now working in the field as a coach, and then coming from a very different perspective of, instead of being the academic, but having that knowledge, how do you think that you get that transfer? Because I'm sure there's plenty of times when you've read research and you've gone, that's an interesting idea or concept, try it, it may work, but it also may not work. And how you sort of use that feedback to keep essentially expanding the framework that you use.
Look, there's a lot of good things that research has done, but not everything. You've just got to be really selective. And the problem really also is there's so much of it.
Yeah.
Like to try and be on top of the literature in a particular field, you just can't. In the good old days, it was much easier. You just kept the key journals.
With that in mind too, has there been actually any concepts that you know well with your background as an academic in economics that you've actually thought, that actually really makes a lot of sense when I think about applying that in a coaching role? Is there anything that you've found that has transferred?
Oh, yeah. I mean, stats and numbers and all that sort of stuff is the key. That's the thing that I find. I record every session. I have spreadsheets and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I could probably do it better if I had more time and that sort of thing. So, but that's the thing. And then I look for correlations in things, which is, that sort of...
Is there anything you found that correlates well?
Oh, they're things that you already knew, like the faster you are, the higher you're going to jump, all that sort of stuff, in terms of that. But in terms of, those sorts of things. But in terms of quantifying it, that's the difference. That's what you can do using statistical modelling, actually quantifying this much leads to this result, this much, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the real thing. So yeah, mostly you've got to, as a coach, the more or less things, but you've got to try to find out. And the other thing is the testing. We keep results of tests, as I'm sure you do, and all that sort of thing, and you can see when things are going to go better and worse based upon the testing results and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really what I'm doing. It's just trying to be rigorous, and I'm sure I can do it better.
We all can. That's not up for debate.
But just rigor rather than hunches. That's what I always want. Something that you can measure. So in my event, there's lots of things we measure. We measure where you grip on the pole, which pole you're using, where your run-up is, where your foot takeoff is position here, all this sort of stuff. The physical parameters of the athlete is obviously measurable, how tall they are, how wide their wingspan, which is really important from us rather than their height. Okay. Then other things have vertical jump and all that, what they can lift, all that sort of thing, lifting their body weight.
Transitioning to pole vault, I think one of the things I want to ask you is and it's still on the coaching, teaching side of things, is how is teaching physical skills and skill acquisition different to imparting sort of other knowledge that is probably not necessarily physical in nature?
Well, that's a good question. So physical skills is things that's trying by doing, isn't it? We're actually physically sitting there talking about, and then someone tries something and it doesn't work. You try a drill and that drill doesn't work. So therefore you try it slightly differently and then it does a little bit better.
Do you think it requires different type of kind of coaching education, for instance? Because I think that one of the things that I've learnt really quickly is that having an understanding of the, say, theoretical knowledge is not the same thing as being able to coach it. And it's not the same thing as then being able to transfer that to a result. You can be the smartest person in the room and be the worst coach there.
Oh, 100%. It's a personality. Like there's a lot of people who try to coach you, just their personality doesn't suit it. I've seen, many cases. So you've got to, the thing about it as a coach, you've also got to have an ability to have all these young people follow what you say. They want to do it, that sort of thing. And so sometimes people ask what's the most important thing, and I often say the most important thing is to try and make sure the track is a cool place to hang out for the kids or athletes or whoever. If they don't want to be there, it's not going to be, sometimes I see, often it's some talented athlete, the parent decides they want to be the coach, the parent and the athlete, and they're sitting there pretty quickly, the kid's not going to keep doing it because they just can't stand it. So you've got to be able to I suppose you need to be a bit charismatic or something like that. You know, that's just what's going on, and if you can, and get people to follow what you're saying. In terms of teaching teaching things like at university, well, I mean, you give classes and all that sort of stuff, but really it's just you giving them information, and then they have to do what you say, otherwise you can fail their exam, can't you?
Yeah, well, it's one of the key problems. The reason I asked that is it's one of the key problems that we have in, say, physio, right, where these days the students are actually very good with their theoretical knowledge, much smarter than I was coming out. Like, I kind of almost laugh now because we have students come through all the time and they know way more than I did when I finished, and that's probably for lots of different reasons. But if you ask them to do a really basic, manual therapy technique, they've done it once in their life and they don't know how to do it and they haven't practiced it enough. And to me, that's a failure of the university to be able to impart the physical skills that require lots of sort of time and the ability to kind of pick up on sensory stuff and all of those things. But I feel like they're almost trying to teach it as if they're teaching knowledge. It's like they think that just doing a bit of rote learning on something is going to solve that problem, and it's clearly not.
Yeah. Presumably they just need more practical experience.
Yeah,
of doing it, working in the field and all that.
Well, it's interesting too, because talking to older physios, that's how the course used to be structured. It used to be much more practically hands-on oriented.
Yeah, you'd be doing a lot of week-to-week hands-on stuff.
Again, that was also probably reflective of a time too, because physiotherapy is a very young profession where the body of research is growing quite rapidly, but 30 years ago it was actually very small. So I think it very much depended on, well, here's my experiences and knowledge from doing this, and this is what I'd recommend to you. But then you're seeing a transfer of, and this is where I think it's always an interesting balance. I'd actually be interested to hear your thoughts of like, well, we have these stats, we have this research now to show that this particular intervention is effective for this particular problem. And it's all well and good to be able to understand the mechanisms behind how that particular stimulus is effective for that pathology. But whether then someone actually has an ability to transfer that into the real world of applying that to a person and communicating that in an effective way is very questionable, as like John's highlighting.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, is that something, I'm interested to even hear your thoughts then too, of like, because when you think about those personal skills, when you think about that translation of theoretical knowledge to real world application, how do you go about approaching that?
I think it's just trying by doing, seeing what works,
Yeah.
practicing, getting good at doing that sort of thing. And I can imagine, my understanding was that the Australian physiotherapy therapists were very highly regarded. I probably still are internationally, all over the place. And it was
and it's not that they're not good therapists. The thing that I find interesting is that I think that there's a divide between the teaching of theoretical knowledge and the teaching of manual skills. And I think it's almost similar in terms of coaching. Like, I think that there's a reasonably big divide in coaching between educating people about the nuts and bolts of, periodization and the structure of training and the physiology and strength training and all those things, versus actually standing on the track and, as you said, being able to communicate and being able to take someone and, okay, I can see that movement and now I've got to come up with a drill, I've got to come up with an idea of how that's going to stick in this person's head. They're different things, and I don't know that we do a lot of teaching or educating in coaching to develop that skill. We're not standing there going, all right, design 15 different ways that we can change someone's, pole vault approach because they're doing this when they approach. I
reckon it's related to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the way universities are functioning, where universities, they're just trying to get people through. They have a process. They're not, like, if you could spend a lot of time teaching people the physical ability to manipulate and whatever it is, and as a physiotherapist, that would require a lot more resources in terms of staff and all that sort of stuff, and that's just not what they're doing. Yeah. They're letting it... You guys have to play out, and you guys have to sort them out when they come and start working for you.
Well, and the reality is the current structure of our profession means that as a graduate, the best thing you can do is find a clinical environment where they're going to give you a very structured teaching process, PD, so you actually learn the nuts and bolts of what to do in the real world, because the reality is you don't see a lot of physiotherapists feeling confident once they graduate. But I think the thing, going back to thinking about why physiotherapy is held in high regards in Australia, I think the thing that's done really well here is you have a lot of people doing research and doing very rigorous research. They're trying to be very methodical, very systematic, trying to produce really high quality research.
Yeah.
And I think that's very reflective when you see in big sports conferences around the world, a lot of very well-known researchers from Australia present their work, and you can see that they do it at very high quality research. I think it's very interesting. I've had some experience of being exposed to different physiotherapists from around the world where they might come from a training program where it's much more practically oriented. They're very good with their hands-on skills, but their actual knowledge of why they're doing something may be limited. It's very easy to criticise them, going like, well, you might say that this particular treatment is effective, but you don't really know the rationale for it. And it seems that we hold in higher regard the ability to be able to have some theoretical rationale for what you do, even if you don't necessarily get that translating into positive results all the time.
One of the things about research, I mean, we sort of poo-hooed a little bit before by saying there's so much going on, but the thing about doing research, and I used to see it was at uni, if there were people who weren't doing research, they could be good teachers, and the course they're teaching could be good, but the course would not necessarily keep up with what was happening in the profession. With the, they wouldn't be, because they're not abreast of of what is the latest thing on them, because they're not right at that involved in studying that sort of thing. What they'd be teaching would be the same as it was 20 years ago, which it shouldn't be. It should be moving, and probably that's one of the reasons why having some research is important, I think. I'm not going to say you shouldn't be doing it.
I think one of the things that it does, and depends on how it's done with funding, because we'll jump into pole vault shortly, but I think what it does is it opens up creativity, because you have to think about, like, where are we going with this? What do I want to know? What questions are coming up from what we've seen from the current body of literature, and where do we want to go with that? And I think that's the cool thing about the interaction between what you did as a researcher and as a coach is you get that opportunity often to ask those questions. And that's the fun part of coaching. It's sometimes the very frustrating part, because there's questions that you can't answer, and you can't answer them easily. You've got performance problems or injuries, and you're trying to work out, like, why does this happen, or why does it continue to happen? But having that ability to ask good questions, and I say good question, people always say there's no such thing as a stupid question, and I say yes, there is, right? And the reason I say that is you need to actually know how to ask a good question, and it's something that allows you to, as you mentioned before, have a way of measuring, have a way of evaluating what's going on, and then being able to implement something. So if you ask a question that doesn't have any of those features, it's probably not that good of a question.
Well, I was just going to ask, with your role with Athletics Australia, do you mentor coaches then as well?
I personally do. I run a mentoring program.
Okay.
Have you done that in the past? Have you mentored?
Not in a formal sense.
Yes, informally.
Many times I've helped people, And the job that I did previously, I was the national junior coach, which was a part-time job. And there was a lot of mentoring and helping and all that sort of stuff. And I certainly do have, if I can.
Informally, if not anything else. But I was going to ask, how do you approach that? What are you hoping to achieve, and how do you go about doing that as a mentor working with less experienced coaches?
Well, it's my passion, and people talk to me, and I talk, and I just talk about as what I think about. This is what I do, and therefore this hopefully will give us, view and justify why I'm doing it, that sort of thing. And I care about it. I like it. I want results. I want Australian pole vaulters to be good. Well, all pole vaulters, but Australian.
On that question, why pole vault then?
Why pole vault? Okay, so I was a pole vaulter myself. I wasn't that good.
Isn't that all coaches?
But it seems to be a common theme of
pretty common. But the thing that I like coaching pole vault for the most is that it is technical. That without the coach, the pole vaulter can't do it. Nobody is born with an innate ability to do it. So
you have a God complex, do you?
Well, maybe I do. Maybe, possibly. But the thing is, if you don't teach them how to do it, they can't jump. So you can have a huge effect on the results as a coach. That's why that's the main thing that I like doing it. And I enjoy, and then they improve, and of course everyone's happy if they improve and all that sort of stuff. When they stop improving, it gets more difficult. So, that's the main thing from my point of view.
And I think I put this in the questions, but to me, pole vault differs from most of the other events quite a bit. And I was thinking about why I saw it like this, and I realised that it's, and someone can correct me if I am missing this, but it's the only event where you use an implement to overcome an obstacle. In every other event in athletics, you either overcome an obstacle or you use an implement, right?
You throw an implement or something like that.
Yeah, you throw an implement, that gets the result. Or you're going over a hurdle or a high jump bar or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What are the peculiarities of that you find interesting and or make it something that you need to have some different skills in that you find, that creates coaching challenges?
Well, yeah, it's like a gymnastic event, but it's using a moving apparatus, which none of the gymnastic events really do either, like the pole, that sort of thing. So
you're not carrying the horse with you.
No, that's right. the only one where they do where the implement moves is the Roman rings in the men's. All the others they're fixed, and then they do something with it. The boys and the girls gymnastics. So that sort of thing. And one of the things is that you can do something. Again, it's relating. You can do something and get a result and the implement makes a difference. And there's a whole lot of things going on about trying to get a particular result. So yeah, that's really what makes it interesting.
The thing, I put this in the questions, and it tends to attract people who have backgrounds in gymnastics. Now you can tell us whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yep. And
the best results seemingly come from indoor competition, right?
Yeah.
The world record, for instance,
was
in the
set
men's, set indoors. Where's the current women's world record?
I think it was outdoors. This and by Ava, which is quite a while ago. But yeah.
And probably on drugs. So, does that, in your mind, in any way suggest that maybe it's more akin to gymnastics than it is track and field?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, especially when the girls started vaulting, because it was an underdeveloped event, people who'd done gymnastics were able to get pretty good results pretty quickly because it's just a new trick. And if you've got high-level gymnastics, you learn a new trick and you can do it quite well. And many of especially girls, had a gymnastics background. But to be an elite pole vaulter, you've got to be an elite athlete as well.
Of course. It's like, I don't think this is a criticism at all of the athleticism of the person. I think some pole vaulters are probably some of the most athletic people across.
Well, they're not as athletic as the people you coach, I can tell you.
Really?
Why? Because they're not. If you had a 100-metre race, they wouldn't get close.
I know, but it's about the sort of multilateral skills. Like if you put one of my athletes upside down, they'd probably be screaming.
Yeah. But there's different aspects to it, and there's also a big psychological associated with pole vaulting. You've got to be a bit sort of crazy. You've got risk taking.
Do you actually on that? Do you screen for that at all?
I don't really screen in any. I should do. I'm much better screen.
Do you think it would make a difference in terms?
I think they self-select to some extent. Like a lot of the pole vaulters that I've coached, they ride motorbikes or they jump off cliffs. They do.
They want to try the event.
They want to try it in that sort of thing.
I've been thinking about this a bit actually because I think one of the things that I've done poorly, and I'm trying to open up more opportunities for this for the athletes, is to take more risks because working with athletes, you're constantly trying to educate them to take, or to mitigate risks. Mm-hmm. But typically, some of the best athletes in the world, the reason they're good is because they're actual risk takers. That's actually, and particularly in the events that I coach, as one coach puts it, he said, like sprinters are like the fastest gun in the West. That's kind of their mentality a lot of the time. So I think it's an interesting idea because one of the things I've tended to find is early on in their careers, they're happy to take lots of risks because that's maybe who they are. As you said, motorbikes on. Then they get a bit of success and they start trying to mitigate the risk. But then it leads to potentially, as you said, some of that sort of psychological resistance to doing new things or to pushing the envelope because they actually have reached the level of performance that they want to protect. And I know that and you can probably comment, I'm sure you've had athletes who do this. Actually, I know there is one that you have issues with at the moment at times, who they come into the sport, they've got no fear, they're jumping, they're doing everything, then they start reaching certain heights or they reach a certain level of performance and then all of a sudden they're scared to actually go over the bar and they pull out of jumps all the time. How do you navigate that in terms of managing that risk and them understanding that they need to be willing to take some risk to actually be a pole vaulter in the first place?
Yeah, look, pole vaulting getting scared is is almost always, at some point in a pole vaulter's career, they will get scared. And it's actually rational to be scared because it's friggin' dangerous.
Yeah, it is dangerous. Yeah.
And so...
You're 4 or 5 metres in the air.
Yeah. And you talk to people, like I've talked a lot to people who've worked with, say, aerial skiers and other gymnasts and divers, and these are the sorts of... It's a similar type thing, and often they lose their bottle. That's pretty common.
Once they have, do they get it back? Or is it always...
They can.
Yeah.
But they may not. And it takes a long time.
I was going to say, how do you navigate that? Do you have certain strategies?
Yeah, I do, yeah. But they don't. You go to the simple, very simple. You find something that they can do. So vaulting off a 2-step run-up or a 4-step run-up or the small pole. And we do that and we do that and we do that and we do that. And until they can do that.
It's like sort of exposure.
Exposure. And they've got to be... One of the things... But pole vaulters, and I'm dealing with it right at the moment with people, you know... The kid is a very talented boy, and I know he could jump international underage
heights,
yeah, good heights, but has got scared. Then they have a session or two where they go a bit better, and all of a sudden they think I'm fixed, but they're not. And so they've got to, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, all this sort of stuff. And I've had people, what you say to the athlete is you say, I know at the moment it feels terrible, it feels you'll never jump again, but if you keep at it, you will. Now, whether that's the truth or not, I'm not quite sure, because sometimes they can't. But you've got to say that to them, because otherwise they wouldn't get anywhere.
I think it's important, right? Because I've had a number of conversations recently with a couple of athletes that aren't doing as well as what they want to be.
Yeah.
And I keep saying to them, everyone has those thoughts. Am I going to be able to run my best? If you guys jump.
Doubting. Yeah.
And I keep saying to them, you need to leave space open in your mind for a world in which your performance is at this level.
Yeah.
Right? And the more that they can do that, I think the more opportunity it creates for them to see that that's possible. And it doesn't need to be that it's the only thing they can think about. Because some athletes think the only thing that's going to happen is I'm going to jump a world record.
Yeah.
But you just need to give them that glimmer of hope sometimes that actually there is a world where that can be possible. And it's been interesting to see some of them really change their idea on that quickly, and others are really stuck with it.
Yeah.
But I would say that it would be difficult for you. The thing I've been thinking about, which I don't know would work for you, and it's probably a terrible idea, but who knows, is whether taking risks in other areas of life would actually change their approach to risk-taking in pole vault.
On that note, because I was actually thought of this question now, and I'd be interested to hear both of your opinions and to see if you know athletes who are like this, because I know you've said this before, John, about a lot of world-class sprinters are often more risk takers. That may be associated with, say, things like alcohol consumption or recreational drugs, which, can actually alter your mind. It can reduce a lot of inhibition. It can expand your idea or horizon of possibilities, even if it's for a very short period of time. But it actually challenges your perceptions of reality and what is possible and what is not. And I'm actually interested, have you ever seen that in pole vaulters, where there may be some athletes who do actually like to
give them some mushrooms or something?
Well, even consume alcohol, and maybe even consume alcohol before training to actually take away some of that inhibition.
Before training.
I don't think.
I know this is going down a slippery slope. I'm not advocating this. I'm just saying if you've found if you've observed any particular.
I can't. I mean, yes, there's certainly been some rogue pole vaulters over the years who've done some stupid things, that sort of stuff.
Taking a shot before training.
I'm
sure people have done it.
They probably have, but that's probably not the ideal thing to do, because you've got to be in fully control with what you're doing.
But this is sort of my criticism of it too. Not criticism, but observation, where as an elite athlete, you really want someone who is going to be responsible and also understand the discipline that's required to achieve excellence. And that obviously goes into other domains of their life. The big ones, diet, sleep, recovery. But at the same time too, if you start to create too much constraints within how you live, does that then also potentially start to narrow how you see yourself in the world, because you actually don't open yourself to new ideas or experiences.
Yeah, I don't want to. I mean, I can't control everything that they do.
No.
And in fact, we don't ever train on a Sunday, and we have sort of an unwritten rule: if you want to go and do something, you can do it on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
And then you'll be able to be okay on Monday, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, come to training ready on
Monday. So that sort of thing. If you do, but a lot of people used to train on Sundays. They compete on Saturday. They train on Sunday. All this sort of stuff. And I remember about 20 years ago, I just decided I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah, I think it's important to give them free time to explore those things.
Yeah.
And if they want to be out with their friends having fun, that's good.
Yeah.
To answer you, Jack, I don't know. As I said to you, I've been exploring this a lot because I think that it's about doing, and it's maybe even it's not risks in terms of dangerous or silly in sense of, as you said, maybe taking drugs or alcohol or whatever. But I think it's maybe opening up expansion into like new behaviors or new opportunities, because that in itself is that idea of like exploration. And I think if you've got that in your mind, like that becomes a bit different for your skill acquisition or whatever it is.
Yeah. No, you've got to have. There's all sorts of things you can do, but no, in terms of taking alcohol before training, I'm not a big fan of that.
No, I don't think that would ever work. In terms of pole vault specifically, you know, like what are the aspects of it that you think of, well, to put this in context, you've had some very successful athletes. You coached the world record holder in the women's pole vault. You coached Steve Hooker, who, he's still the Australian record holder, isn't he? He wasn't with you at that time, but, what did he end up jumping with you?
He jumped 5 metres 91 at Box Hill.
Yeah.
And he won the Commonwealth Games.
At a local meet.
Yeah. In the Interclub at Box Hill. But he jumped 5'8". He won the Commonwealth Games. He was number 1 in the world. I coached in 2006.
Yeah, so at different points you've had the number 1 female and number 1 male in the world.
Yeah.
Right? What are the aspects of those athletes that made them successful? And is that something that you develop, or is that and I think I put it in the question, like...
Yeah.
That those people just come along and you've got to be willing to kind of recruit them into your program of pole vault?
Well, they were both physically hugely talented athletes.
In what aspects?
Okay, so Emma George was, hugely talented. Now, again, you can be an elite international pole vaulter without being necessarily super elite track and field athlete. Emma was a pretty good schoolgirl sprinter and a long jumper. I think she ran about 12 seconds for 100, bit probably not quite, and not 6 metres in long jump or something like that. But she'd done circus. She was a circus performer when she was a child. She was
similar, like gymnastics kind of.
Yeah, similar
exposure.
type thing. She was in a thing called the Flying Fruit Fly Circus.
That's cool.
Yeah, she was, which was in Albury, and they travelled around. It was a school, and so did various trapeze and different things. So she was. She was perfectly suited to be a pole vaulter in the sense that
was she tall?
She wasn't tall. No, she was one. I think not. I'm not quite. She was average height. She was physically good runner, and she developed muscle very well, and she was strong and very robust sort of athlete.
But had that ability to be able to manipulate her body well in space.
Yeah. So she had everything going for her, and she jumped 4 metres 60, which would be making teams now. And this was last
it's
century.
Still competitive.
Yeah, last century.
This is 25 years.
Yeah. So she was a good athlete. So the thing was, she had it, and we just trained and I just treated her like any of the boys that I'd coached over the years, and we just trained in a particular way, and she got very good results. Again, she wouldn't have made an Australian team in any other event. Like that was, and Steve Hooker, I would say the same. He wouldn't have made a team in another event. Again, very good athlete. Both parents were international athletes, but he wasn't that good at all of these other things initially. Because he was tall and skinny and not very well coordinated as a kid, but very committed, wanted to do it more than anything, more or less, and trained all the time. And I remember when he was a young boy, I'd have all these sessions with the older elite athletes, and he'd want to come to every single session and all this sort of stuff, and he was very, very committed to it. But again, he had all sorts of problems. It wasn't smooth sailing with him. Like he had...
In what sense?
He had trouble you were talking about taking off. He couldn't take off for long periods of time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, very, very, huge problems. And eventually that finished him off. In 2012, he couldn't take off, and looked like and that was the end of it. After the London Olympics, that was the end. He didn't compete again. Again, it was those were the things. So if I was talk about recruiting, if someone listening, If you've got to be a reasonably good track and field athlete, and if you are prepared to work for a long period of time to learn how to do a particular skill, and not everyone can do it, but if you want to learn to, and it has to be taught, then you can get better results than you can in other things.
But on that, are there physical attributes that you prefer? What are the things you
okay, so what you want to do, you want to be average height.
You don't want to be too tall.
You don't want to. You don't. Yeah. See, the thing is, there's an advantage being tall in pole vault because you're opening the pole ground angle and you're close to the vertical. But if that was the only thing that was going on, all pole vaulters would be like basketballers, and they're not. And the reason is that once you're off the ground, if you're tall, you're much more awkward.
Yeah.
So that's why you'll see gymnasts are little. And the reason mostly they're short because they're no good once they get in the air. So pole vaulters can be there's all sorts of shapes and sizes. Renaud Lavillenie, who won the Olympics, is 175 metres tall, I think, only a little guy.
He's 5'9",
Yeah. Not tall at all, but he's a good runner. So you want them to be a good runner. You want them to be able to have very good power to weight ratio. That's the thing.
Yeah, they're typically not overly muscular.
No, you don't want to be too, because most of the strengthening work we do is body weight, gymnastic type thing, chin-ups and climbing ropes and all that sort of stuff, swing on bars, all that sort of thing, because that's all it is. So yeah, that's what you want to do, and of course the power to weight ratio is really, it's for the girls especially when they develop, and you've got to be able to be right on top of that, and it's politically difficult because if you put on weight, you're not going to be able to jump. Like that's the sort of thing. So
yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I had this actually with someone recently about, and Jack and I have spoken about this a number of times, the divergence that happens between performance and health at a certain level of competition.
Yeah.
And at the really pointy end, there are periods where you're actually going away from being healthy in order to get performance. Now, you're not going to want to be at a really ridiculously low body fat percentage for a long period of time, because ultimately that will impact your performance.
Yeah.
But if it's 3 or 4 weeks where you're sitting below what would be considered a really healthy body fat for a major comp, that's probably actually ideal.
It's hard to manipulate that precisely. But,
obviously it depends. If you've got particularly if you've got people in your team who are good with that, dietetics and all of those things, they can, and the medical team, they can monitor that pretty closely and push the envelope if that athlete's sort of willing to do that.
Yeah. No, that's so. In terms of it's the girls, especially when they go through puberty, that sort of thing. When they're good when they're young, and then they will go backwards for a period of time in pole vaulting in particular, and other events I expect as well.
What you mentioned before, certain anthropometric features.
Yep.
What specific ones relating to pole vault that you find more useful?
Essentially, a reasonably good runner.
Yeah, no, but you mentioned sort of like limb length.
Yeah, limb length. Yes, ideally, if your arm's length is greater than your height, that is better, because in terms of vaulting, you're wanting, that makes you effectively taller in terms of where you are reaching the pole above your head, and so that's helpful. It's helpful in many things, like it's helpful in rowing, throwing discuses, all these sorts of basketball, all these sort of things, because you're not too awkward in the air because you're not so tall, but you're able to do that. So that's really, but you can. It's just as long as the pole vaulters come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. If you really can't run at all, it is difficult to get a very good result. That's the thing.
You mentioned before, is that one of the key KPIs is, running speed, particularly with the pole, is a big differentiator of those who can actually or have the capability of jumping higher? It
is. When you look at a major international competition, they usually will do all of, do the data and the laser and see how fast they are. And often the result in the competition is very closely related to how fast they were. And the reason there is when you're at a major international competition, the vaulters don't have technical faults. They're all very, very good pole vaulters. And so that's the thing. So Mondo Duplantis, the best guy in the world,
he's the fastest on the runway.
He's the fastest at the moment, yeah. And he doesn't jump exactly the way in which you would classically teach either, but he is faster than all the others. And he jumps higher, so,
All right, you brought up Mondo.
Yeah.
And you obviously lived through the Sergei Bubka era.
Yep.
Right? And more recently, we've obviously lived through the Usain Bolt era.
Yep.
As someone who's been involved in the sport since the 1970s, do you think these standout athletes who are breaking world records and are very rarely getting beaten, do you actually think that's good for the sport or the event?
That's interesting. I think it probably is. Now, this is a bit controversial because people always talk about the benefit that all of the other golfers got from Tiger Woods being so good, or Michael Jordan, all this sort of stuff. So I think if it draws attention to the sport and away from other sports, I think that's probably good. One of the problems I know meets in Europe and all this sort of stuff, when they won't have a meet, the money is a problem because they say unless Usain Bolt's here, nobody's going to watch. And he ends up getting nearly all of the money.
Yeah, and then no one else
and
wants
nobody
to
else gets anything. And so if you're not coaching Usain Bolt, everyone's all like... And that's with Mondo, that's the same. Unless he's in the field, they don't want to put a pole vault on. And the only way to get him there
is to pay him
to pay him nearly as much as you're paying the rest of the people there. So that's the problem. That's an economic issue of the actual putting on the meet. But I think in terms of, if you stand back broader from the rest of the field, like we had the nitro thing here and everyone in Australia followed it because Usain Bolt was here, like that was something. But, people were... But in terms of purists like you and I, there's issues. But I do think it's better if we can get some attention on our sport.
Rather than like in the terms of that viewership or whatever, do you personally think it's good as a consumer of the sport who loves it?
Oh, no.
Do you like it or not really?
No, not really, because I want to see competition.
Yeah.
I want to see other people having a chance to win, all that sort of stuff. One of the things about pole vault, though, is that about 1 in 10 competitions, something like that, vaulters won't clear their first height, no matter the best shape they're in. And so what that means is even if Mondo's in the field, you've got a chance of getting beaten him because he can no height.
With that, are there typical faults that cause that? Or is it a multitude of things?
It's a multitude of things. It could be environmental. The wind makes a huge difference in pole vault.
Actually, here's a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm really annoyed that pole vault doesn't have a wind gauge because I think it's cheating that you guys can have as much wind as you like.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you could train with perfect wind conditions all the time, which they used to be able to do in Perth with the Fremantle Doctor, they got good at jumping with that, and then they couldn't jump very well elsewhere. The problem, you're right, if you have perfect conditions, often you have a massive tailwind and you'll stuff up because your poles will be wrong.
But the same thing happens in sprinting, for instance. Like, just because it's a 6 metre tailwind doesn't mean you run fast. Some people can't actually handle it.
Yeah. Well, they can't handle it. Pole vault, it's even more difficult. Your run-up won't be in the right spot. There's a whole lot of things. And if it's variable, pole vaulting's about being consistent.
Why don't they measure it, do you know?
I think it just would introduce... It's just historic. It hasn't been done. It would be another aspect of another cost associated with putting on a meet, and it would be difficult to do. Like, I mean, there were times...
I'm going to petition for it to happen.
You're going to? Oh, well. We'll see. We'll see how you go. There wasn't... in the States, I've seen people putting big fans indoors and all this sort of stuff.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of stupid, because then you've got perfectly consistent wind and all this sort of thing. I don't know whether there's anything that rules against doing that. There should be. I don't know.
Well, why would they do it if it wasn't helpful?
Well, of course it would be helpful if you could have exactly the same tailwind all the time. If you had the same tailwind all the time, it would be good. If it's variable, that's the hard thing. That's the issue.
But as I said, I feel like it's unfair that you get to claim all of these results that could be wind aided.
Well, the altitude is another one as well. See, the Bubka broke a number of world records at Sastriere in Italy, up in the ski resort.
Yeah.
That was the thing, because that certainly helps. Because you often, if it's nice weather up there.
Is there anything else that you wanted to ask Jack before we finish
I'm also
up?
mindful of your time there too. Yeah.
All right. Mark, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time. I feel like we only just touched the surface. So, given that you are a local to us here at MAD, we may actually get you back on if you're okay with that at some stage.
Oh, we'd love to. It was good fun.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Jack. Thanks.